Hello again, everybody. I'm Rusty, aka William Robinson, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. And welcome to my podcast, The Blues Doctor Recommends. This is the new updated version of the podcast, and we're glad you're here. You know, the Blues Doctor approaches this podcast a little different. We want to focus on the messy questions, on the uncomfortable questions about healthcare in the U.S. that most podcasters and analysts don't want to talk about because it doesn't fit their bias. As the Blues Doctor, I take a different approach. I want to tackle those uncomfortable questions by looking at as much factual information as I can before trying to make a decision. You know, I came from a working class background, and I had the opportunity to go to college and medical school. In the 40 years since then, I've worked as a physician, an administrator, an academician, a researcher, and have observed the U.S. healthcare system at many levels for a long time. And I don't look at things from either a left or right-wing perspective, so you may be surprised at some of the conclusions I come to. And life is not meant to be serious all the time. We have to do something to take our minds off the uncomfortable things, right? We have made it a point to talk about music in every show, especially blues music. You know, I'm a fan and occasional performer, and I've learned that blues truly is America's music, and it has so much to say about our country. Finally, we need you to hit the thumbs up, just like always, to share, subscribe, and make comments, and even tell us when and where you're listening to this. It really does make a difference. And now let's get on with it. Starting last week, we began to address one of the big questions I'd like to tackle, which is who killed health care in the U.S.? That takes in a lot of information, so we're trying to break it down into smaller, more easily digestible parts, and we'll be talking about that over the next few weeks. We started this series 2 weeks ago with the question, what happened in the past that shaped U.S. healthcare today? Then 1 week ago, we asked, why can't we cure cancer? We discussed research a good bit in that episode, and from the comments we received, we realized that we should probably back up a little bit and explain medical research in the U.S. a little bit more. So our question this week is, who should pay for medical research, the government or private industry? The medical research industry, as it exists today in the U.S. and elsewhere, is a product of a series of reforms that took place after World War II. Before that, medical research was pretty informal. If you were a doctor and you thought that a new treatment was going to be better than whatever the old one was, you just started using that treatment and then wrote about your experience afterward. There was little or no oversight. Take, for example, last week we mentioned Dr. Ernst Wertheim. He was the pioneer of the use of radical hysterectomy for cervical cancer. He wrote about it in a series of papers in medical journals, and the most important one was from 1907. He had treated between 400 and 500 women with radical hysterectomy, that specific operation, for cervical cancer, and then summarized the results. By our standards, it was pretty horrifying. He didn't tell any of the patients that he was doing an experimental operation, nor did he ask for an informed consent, nor did he mention that he was planning to publish the results. The results, too, were pretty bad from our point of view. The mortality was around 10%, meaning 10% of the patients did not survive more than 30 days after the procedure itself. And the recurrence rate was greater than 50%, and virtually all of them who recurred died within a couple of years. The important thing he did show was that if you only looked at the women whose cancers were confined to the cervix at the time of the surgery and were no more than about 6 centimeters across, the survival rate for those women was much better. In fact, they were among the first cures of cervical cancer that had ever been reported. And that was the result of a single, well-defined treatment. So we do owe Dr. Wertheim a lot. Today, it's much different. largely as the result of the Nazi experimentations of World War II. The horrors of the Nazi medical establishment have been reported many times, so I won't try to repeat that. But what I will say is that they have made the world aware that medical research could be abused for evil purposes. Another major event that impacted medical practice in research were the so-called Tuskegee trials. This trial was started in Alabama in the 1930s to observe the long-term effects of syphilis, the sexually transmitted disease. There was no cure for syphilis at the time, so all doctors could do really was manage the symptoms. So it seemed reasonable and even ethical to record those symptoms long-term. But the trial went off the tracks very quickly. The researchers, mostly doctors from the Northeast, exclusively white, picked black men as their research cohort, both because syphilis was relatively common in black men and, frankly, because they felt it would be easier to manipulate poor black men who are relatively poorly educated. On top of that, they were often sharecroppers who had little or no money, and they were only 2 generations removed from slavery. And from there it got worse. Penicillin, which was the first real cure for syphilis, became available in the 1940s. But the investigators declined to tell the research subjects about that. Most of the subjects had minimal access to outside information, and they never doubted that their investigators had their best interests in mind. But that was not the case. The trial continued for another 30 years into the 1970s until it was widely publicized and stopped. At least some of the investigators were prosecuted, but none of them were ever convicted, and very little punishment really occurred. As a result of the Nazi atrocities and later the Tuskegee experiments, the Allies and others met to develop what became the Helsinki Declarations, which established an ethical framework for medical research based on several things, including personal autonomy, beneficence, justice, and scientific validity, among some other things. This is the framework we use to this day, with some modifications. It requires every potential investigator to submit his or her research plan to a standing committee, often called an IRB, or Institutional Review Board. The board actually examines the plan carefully and can ask for changes to be made or even refuse the trial altogether. The investigators must send regular follow-up reports to the IRB, which can pause or discontinue the trial at any time. The point of this is that we as a society recognize that medical research is vital if we are to progress, and that it must be accompanied by a robust oversight system. The vast majority of investigators are very comfortable and very supportive of that system to this day. Another major component of the medical research industry is funding. Most medical research, both bench science and clinical research with human subjects, is very expensive. Up until the 1960s, most research was funded by philanthropies. Many nonprofit foundations funded trials of various kinds, and many still do. Private industry funded medical research also, but the amount of money involved was vastly less than today. Many universities or groups of universities funded medical research as well. That started to change in the 1960s with the development of the Great Society by President Johnson. Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs began to pump money into healthcare, not just for the purpose of paying for the care itself, but also to stimulate research and to pay medical trainees. Then in 1971, President Nixon announced the War on Cancer, which dramatically increased funding for cancer research in particular. As a result of these efforts, the U.S. government was the largest single source of research funding around the world by the 1980s or so. And it was generally quite successful. Extensive networks of hospitals, investigators, and staff were created to examine research questions on a large scale. Now, instead of Dr. Wertheim reporting on a few hundred patients he'd seen over the course of his whole career, These new nationwide groups could collect data on thousands of patients in a much shorter time. And data collection could be standardized across the various sites and entered into a single database, which allowed for mathematically based statistical analysis to be done. Many new treatments were proven to be effective and became part of standard care as a result of this research system. Things started to change in the 2000s. The U.S. budget was under pressure to provide for homeland security in response to 9/11, and deficit spending resulted. Legislators were forced to cut back on spending on, quote, non-essential items, and medical research funding was a relatively easy target. In fact, by 2012, the government had reduced the number of cancer research groups that it had traditionally funded from 11 to 5. The amount of money available for individual grants shrank as well. And many fewer young investigators could get the funding to start their own labs or carry out experiments. At the same time, private pharmaceutical profits were rising rapidly as the population aged and more people had need of various kinds of drugs, including anti-cancer drugs. And many of them put that additional money into research. Private research centers and networks exploded in number in the 2010s, and by 2020 or so, private firms had replaced the government as the leading supporter of medical research in the U.S. Which leads us back to our question: who should fund medical research? Private industry or the federal government? Well, there are pluses and minuses to each, as you might guess. It should be no surprise that private companies are much more efficient and can move much faster than the government. A private research trial that takes 2 years, say, from start to finish, may take the government 6 to 9 years. And since our knowledge of disease at the molecular level is increasing so rapidly now, the research question that you are asking could become obsolete before the government trial could be finished. On the other hand, the only reason that a private company will put its money into research is that they think there's a potential profit to be made. To do otherwise would be a misuse of the shareholders' money and is actually illegal. So, if there is little or no money to be made as a result of the trial, industry will not support it. Those trials would not have been done unless the government supported them. Here's an example. In women with ovarian cancer, it had been long postulated that chemotherapy would be more effective if it were given directly into the abdominal cavity as compared to the traditional method of giving it through an IV. It was presumed that ovarian cancer was largely constricted or confined to the abdominal cavity, and therefore, if you could put the drug in direct contact with the disease, it would work better. In the 1980s, the drugs cisplatin and carboplatin were by far the most important drugs for ovarian cancer. A group of investigators, funded primarily by the government, decided to use those drugs in a trial to compare intra-abdominal or intraperitoneal administration of chemotherapy to the traditional or standard IV administration. The idea being, or the hypothesis being, that the intraperitoneal version of the chemotherapy would work better. And it did. There were actually a series of trials addressing various aspects of intraperitoneal chemotherapy for ovarian cancer. And now, full disclosure, I was an investigator in several of those trials, and they all suggested a survival advantage of about a year for the study arm. That is, the women who got intraperitoneal cisplatin lived about a year longer than the women who got intravenous or IV cisplatin. But there was no money to be made because those drugs were old, and there were no new drugs that could be produced and sold. So industry didn't support those trials. And what about ethics? Private industry has generally been very supportive of the Helsinki declarations and the IRB-based oversight systems. The government has put even more effort into maintaining ethical standards. There are multiple layers within the NIH and the NCI, or National Cancer Institute, that evaluate the safety of potential trials over and above just the IRB system. So what is the right answer? Should government fund research, or should private industry fund it? Based on the things we've mentioned here, both are clearly important. The government will support important trials that have no potential for profit that industry just won't. On the other hand, industry, at least in the current era, has considerably more money to support trials than the government and can do them more quickly. They don't face the pressures of a budget-limited Congress that can and has cut funding for research over the last several years. I believe we need both an appropriately funded government program of research as well as a private program. Right now, that's not really the case. As I mentioned, federal funding for medical research has been falling for a number of years, and important research has not been done as a result. Perhaps even more worrisome, that lack of funding has discouraged many bright young physician investigators from pursuing a career in research. My own trainees often ask me in recent years how I maintained a successful research career based on federal funding. Frankly, the answer is that there was much more money to go around when I was their age. What can we do about that? Well, here's three things. First, tell your congressman you support increased funding for medical research. Number two, consider giving to nonprofits that support research like the American Cancer Society and many others. Three, if you have the opportunity to participate in a research study, please do so. Or recommend it to your family and friends if they have the opportunity to participate. If nothing else, you'll get the benefit of knowing you've made a contribution that will help someone who's in your shoes a few years from now. As always, I invite questions and comments. This was just a very quick summary of the medical research system, and I'm sure I've left out important things. And this one is a biggie for me, as you can probably tell. I made a career out of research, and I hope that it's not compromised in the future. Mardi Gras is now in full swing, as I guess you can see from my shirt here. There are 10 parades scheduled the weekend of February 6th through 8th, and it's finally warmed up, so the weather is nice also. Here's a few musical samples from the parades and from local music around town this weekend. Crowd on St. Charles Avenue. Beautiful day. February 7th, Saturday, first weekend of Mardi Gras. Believe it or not, this is about 1/3 the size of the crowd for next weekend's parades for Mardi Gras. And it goes on like this for approximately 6 miles in uptown New Orleans.
Don't you wish your girlfriend was wrong like me? Don't you wish your girlfriend was fun like me? Don't you?
And that's about all we have this week. Try to catch Mardi Gras in New Orleans sometime if you can. There's really nothing else like it. You know, I know Mobile and some other places have parades, and there's nothing against Mobile, but honestly, they are smaller and less exciting than the New Orleans Mardi Gras experience by orders of magnitude. And overall size, well, nothing really comes close. New Orleans hosts lots of big events. Let's compare, say, WrestleMania, which has been in New Orleans twice. That typically brings between 75 and 100,000 people to town, which is great. Okay, how about the Super Bowl? Last year's game, which was in New Orleans, and that was either the ninth or 10th game that was in New Orleans, brought 100 to 150,000. Again, terrific. The local merchants and hospitality industry loves that. Mardi Gras, how about 500,000? And it happens every single year. There really is no comparison. Anyway, as I usually say at this point, please watch next week's podcast. Okay? See you later.